Australia, the lucky country. Plentiful land, diverse climates, rich natural resources. A land built on the dream of a perfectly equal society for all men. Terms and conditions applied. Equal society was for whites only. Excluded Aboriginal people, Asians, Africans, Pacific Islanders and all other non-white races. The White Australia policy was designed to keep Australia white.
A key advisor to the British government, Haggard believes the empire will be strengthened by a large-scale migration of Britons to the vast continent of Australia. Australians will become the young of the British.
For Haggard, the British Empire was the great house with many empty rooms, and Australia was one of the biggest and emptiest of the rooms. And Rider Haggard wanted the British race to fill all of the rooms so it could maintain itself in this vast house. And Australia had to be filled.
Not only will the British pay for the scheme, but Australia will gain the people it needs to populate lands left empty by the removal of Indigenous Australians. In turn, the nation will be better able to defend itself against what it fears more than anything else: invasion from the Asian North.
That, in a nutshell, was the Australian fear, the yellow peril. 400 million Chinese coming down, sweeping on the top of it, over the top of us. And that's how Rider Haggard sold his idea for the British migration scheme.
The war to end all wars is finally over. 60,000 Australian troops lie dead. But the horror of sacrifice and suffering will have unexpected consequences. The White Australia policy is about to come under the glare of an international spotlight. It's 1919, and now the Labor firebrand, Billy Hughes, is the nation's Prime Minister. At Federation, he called for a ban on all migrants who weren't white. The passing of time and the Great War has only strengthened his faith.
Hughes was a remarkable character, small, deaf, but fiercely determined, a union leader. He knew how to talk to men, but he was even more striking amongst the diplomats and aristocrats in Paris in 1919.
The Paris Peace Conference will create a new world order. Out of the ashes of the Great War, a League of Nations will be born to secure peace for generations to come. In the cool January air, 72 delegates from 32 nations gather to begin 6 months of negotiations. The Big Four, America, Britain, France, and Italy, hope to dictate proceedings. But there's now a new world power taking their place at the top table.
The Japanese saw themselves as being the leader of Asia. And that was where the Japanese were heading. And certainly by 1919, because of the fact that Japan was selected as one of the 5 great powers, that sort of sentiment or the feeling was being confirmed by the Western great powers.
They expected to be accepted as a civilized people. And they found, having jumped through all the hoops, there was one hoop they could never jump through, and that is they weren't white.
The Japanese delegation, led by Baron Makino Nobuaki, has a very clear wish. They want racial equality enshrined into this new world order. It's a demand that could threaten the entire League of Nations, and even make Australia's immigration policies illegal under international law.
There were a number of political pressure groups back in Japan demanding that the racial equality clause had to be a condition of Japan's acceptance of the creation of the League of Nations. So the Japanese delegates in Paris were put under enormous pressure from very powerful and influential lobbying groups in Japan in order to succeed on the racial equality negotiations.
Billy Hughes has one main objective in Paris. He links the death of 60,000 diggers to the preservation of empire and white Australia. Anything that questions this assertion will be rejected out of hand. Japan's racial equality proposal is unacceptable.
Hughes would insist that if there was any consideration of a racial equality clause, that the Australian delegation would leave Versailles bag and baggage.
But as negotiations get underway in the opulent surrounds of the Hotel de Crillon, it seems that Hughes is not alone in his objections. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George and American President Woodrow Wilson also have strong reservations about the racial equality proposal. But they're determined to keep diplomatically quiet and avoid offending the Japanese.
The British and the Americans, they don't want a strongly worded racial equality clause either. But there is the issue of relations with Japan. They now know if they don't support this racial equality clause, possibly Japan will walk away from the League of Nations. Certainly their relationship will be harmed. But if they can move most of the blame onto Hughes, if they can make Hughes the patsy, then they can also get what they want.
And so, in the rarefied air of Paris in the spring, a skillful plan is hatched. Britain and America will hold their tongues and point the Japanese towards the noisy Hughes.
The Japanese were very patient, and they tried again and again, and they tried the Americans, and the Americans said, well, it's not up to us, you have to talk to the British. So they talk to the British, and the British say, well, we have a problem with these dominions, you know, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, you'll have to deal with them. So the Japanese endeavour to talk to all the leaders of the dominions, and most of them say, well, you know, we wouldn't mind this, but there's always Australia that's the problem.
The Japanese have no other option but to deal directly with Hughes and suffer the inevitable consequences.
The Japanese found him impossible to negotiate with. He was not very statesmanlike as far as the Japanese were concerned, because other statesmen and delegates at the Paris behaved in a civilized manner, in a very diplomatic manner.
They say, this man is a peasant. How is it that we have to try and deal with this ignorant provincial from Australia? Why don't the British make him behave?
Often Hughes pretended that he wasn't around when the Japanese requested to see him. And when they did, Hughes would just kind of, pretend that he couldn't understand what they were saying when they were speaking to him, obviously in English.
Hughes's unique diplomatic approach is causing alarm at home. In Melbourne, the Director of Military Intelligence, Edmund Peace, believes the consequences of ignoring Japan's demands could be disastrous.
Despite the fact Japan's an ally, the Australian military still sees Japan as its #1 threat in the region. So for peace, if countries like Australia insist that there is no racial equality clause, that the Australians are actually walking into a trap.
Despite Peace's dire warnings, Hughes is unequivocal. White Australia must be protected. The Australian Prime Minister has played the role of patsy to perfection.
The American-British ploy works. The Japanese believe Billy Hughes is the central stumbling block. Indeed, Baron Makino, one of the senior members of the Japanese delegation, writes back to Tokyo that the racial equality clause, its fate, rests in the hands of one man, the Australian Prime Minister.
After 3 long months of negotiations, the fate of the racial equality proposal and potentially the legality of white Australia hang in the balance. At the Palace of Versailles, a vote is taken. A majority of delegates support the proposal. But the American president intervenes.
Wilson, from the chair, said there's not unanimity, and this is an issue on which there must be unanimity, therefore it is lost. Quite against all procedure of what had been regarded as normal meeting procedure in the League itself.
The Japanese were mortified. The whole notion of the League of Nations was built on the idea that it should create a fairer and more just international order. And by denying this, supposedly basic principle of equality of states, how could this League of Nations really effectively provide an international order?
On the 28th of June 1919, the peace treaty is finally signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Denied its racial equality clause, Japan departs Paris humiliated and embittered against the West. Billy Hughes, on the other hand, leaves for Australia, head held high.
Hughes returns to Australia a conquering hero, and always in his public speeches he refers to the racial equality clause and he refers to the protection of the White Australia policy.
White Australia is yours. You may do with it what you please. My colleagues and I have brought that great principle back from the conference, as safe as it was on the day when it was first adopted.
Hughes, already a hero to the Australian soldiers, has never been so popular. The little digger who went into battle at Versailles to save white Australia. But the triumphalism hides a grave truth.
Back in Australia, people like Edmund Peace are devastated by the decision. They're devastated because Australia leaves Paris as Japan's #1 enemy in the region.
Well, there were people who saw the defeat at Versailles and as being one of those things which pushed the Japanese towards militarism, imperialism, and militant anti-Western feeling.
In the coming years, Japan's aggression will build. Ironically, by protecting its borders and the dream of a white utopia, Australia has helped sow the seeds for its darkest fears to be realised.